Prehistoric communities for thousands of years, probably tens of thousands of years, actually had very little increase in the size of their groups or tribes. In fact, sometimes the group or tribe population decreased significantly, depending upon the hazard they encountered. But roughly 30 to 10,000 years ago, we do start to see those changes that we describe in terms of domestication of plants and animals and urbanization. Now, these weren't huge big cities all at once, but slowly but certain and surely, people realized that there were advantages in terms of security and safety, as well as constant sources of, or reliable sources of food. They could also control their environment to some extent, and this allowed for greater stability, improved maternal and infant survival, and that really was a big challenge at the time to, at the very least, maintain the group, if not to increase the size of the group. So cities were eventually established, slowly but certainly, to provide housing for the increasing and improving populations. There are, however, problems with developing these stable, interactive sites. Things that we talk about as villages or towns, or even just local tribe populations that might be small but stable and in pretty much one location. What happens when populations do increase? Perhaps you're starting to reach the limit of the resources that are in those surrounding areas. So here's an image of an ancient city that to some extent still can be used today. You can see that people have taken advantage of the actual geographic structures and the local rock formations to create the city. And that's what our ancestors often would do. They would take advantage of what was around them. As we have these crowded living conditions in urban dwelling, we start to see different problems in terms of disease. So while we might have improved maternal and infant survival, perhaps the whole group now became more vulnerable to certain types of diseases, often associated with what we think of today as public health issues like clean water. And that was one of our ancestors' concerns. Many of our ancient cities, especially the historically significant ones, were established in areas on Earth that were very close to rivers. So prehistoric humans often noticed that it was really important to have a good source of clean water. They probably related or could see that sometimes if people drank water that didn't appear to look tasty or look clean, I should say, or smell or taste good, that we might see more folks who got sick. So the concept of clean water and having good sources of what we call potable or drinking water was important to our ancestors and is, of course, to us today. They often attributed the activities around them to invisible forces. It is hard to explain the unseen or activities that happen or occurrences that appear to come out of nowhere. And so eventually, spiritual or mystical forces were assigned or given acknowledgement or credit for these mystical occurrences, especially in terms of disease. So gods and goddesses were recognized as being the overseers. And for some communities and some areas of the world, many gods and goddesses were involved in controlling every aspect of everyday life. There might be a god or goddess for every single item or activity that a person went through. And this is part of what's going to help us stay healthy and not get sick, and of course keep our food and water clean. As our ancestors improved their ability to maintain clean water supplies and healthy sources of food, of course the communities increased in size. And so we do find, again, in key areas in the world, in places like China, the Indus Valley, the Fertile Crescent near the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, the Nile, and in the Incan and Mayan civilizations. Having good sources of clean water, maybe not necessarily as rivers, but just at least having good sources of reliable water was important. Observations as what someone ate and their health conditions was also noted. Again, attributed to gods and goddesses, but eventually rules were developed. We call them dietary laws. There are still dietary laws that are used by certain religious groups today. And oftentimes we suspect, we can't necessarily go back in time and clearly demonstrate the association, but it certainly seems that the types of dietary laws that are used today, and even the ancient ones, were associated with the eating of certain types of food that had a higher risk of transmitting disease-causing organisms. Preservation of food was important to provide a steady source of nutrition, and different techniques were developed, like pickling, salting, and drying. All of these techniques that are good food preservation methods are also good at inhibiting or destroying disease-causing organisms that might be in the food. Now, it doesn't eliminate all of them, but it certainly reduces them to a significant number, perhaps, to make it healthier for ancestors to consume. There were also sources of food like honey and wine that could also be used as medicinal treatments. So all of these are becoming sources of health and wellness to improve the population survival in these communities, and of course they continue to get larger and more sophisticated. But people still did get sick. No matter how hard you try, sometimes the microorganisms win. And so, who do you blame? Well, sometimes people would blame their neighbors. Sometimes they believed that the diseases and epidemics were a punishment from those gods and goddesses that they gave sort of control to their everyday activities. If you got sick, it's because you did something wrong to displease the god or goddess. If you didn't get sick, then apparently you were doing everything right and you had some kind of protection, or you were favored with divine intervention. And this was, again, part of every activity in everyday life. And it was constantly sort of around people all the time. They were very aware of the unseen forces that were around them. But how do we actually demonstrate or prove this is what happened? Well, for historic evidence, we do have documents that were left to us. Sometimes they're not too many, but we do have some. But what about prehistoric evidence of how our ancestors coped with these challenges of everyday life? What happened when they got sick? What did they do? What happened when they got injured? Did they know how to set bones? Did they know how to stitch up a wound? Did they care for one another if someone was sick or injured? We take it for granted today that if we're sick or injured, someone will take care of us. Was that always true? There's significant archaeologic and now genetic studies that have demonstrated that, yes, indeed, some of this did occur. Finding physical evidence of it is not easy, and it's pretty scant in some places. But there are some resources that tell us these things did occur. One such bit of evidence comes from a large cave in what is now modern-day Iraq. The very northern tip of Iraq is a cave called the Shanidar cave. This cave was occupied for tens of thousands of years, especially if we go back tens of thousands of years, the occupation by Neanderthals. Now, human beings, or Homo sapiens, have occupied it too in more recent times, but I don't know if you can tell from the photo in the top right, this is a huge cave. It's an ideal location because not only is the size significant inside the cave, but the bottom right photo shows you an image of looking out from the cave. It also has a great view. You could see if anyone was coming from miles away. And apparently, from some of the reading that I've done, the cave is not easily accessed even today. So it was an ideal private location, if you will, for some of the ancestors that we know about. Again, if you follow that URL at the bottom of the slide, you can find out more about the Shanidar cave. But fortunately for us, archaeologists have been able to dig back layer after layer and discover how humans and Neanderthals used the cave and interacted with one another in the cave. There have been 10 Neanderthal skeletons that have been discovered in the cave that lived there roughly 45,000 years ago. The skeletons have been numbered 1 through 10 in Roman numerals, and we're going to discuss a little bit about the skeleton that's numbered 1. They call him Shanidar 1. And this particular skeleton has been of keen interest to folks who are curious about ancient medical practices and how human beings dealt with illness and injury, and curious about whether or not our ancestors, including Neanderthals, were capable of care and what we would think of today as sort of first aid or nursing or long-term care. And this skeleton does show evidence of all of those things. Now, it's hard to extrapolate. You really almost can't extrapolate, generalize, but you can see, at least for this one individual, whether this is just unique for this one individual and the small family that surrounded him, there was that kind of glimmer of, yes, indeed, first aid and long-term care did take place. Because Shanidar 1 had some injuries that had been tended. In other words, some kind of first aid was given, or medical intervention, surgical intervention perhaps. It had healed, but because of the seriousness of the injury, he had a permanent disability. His disability, because of his injury, resulted in blindness in his left eye. He was deaf. His right forearm was missing. There was an injury to his right leg that caused him to limp. He lived well into his 40s, even with these injuries and this disability, which at this time would have been very rare. Being a 40-year-old Neanderthal at this time was old age, and to have lived this long with that disability was almost impossible, because if they were left on their own devices, in other words, if they had no extra care to get food and shelter and care for their wounds or injuries, they would have succumbed to essentially predation by some of the wild animals that lived in and around that area. But he didn't. He survived, and apparently survived fairly well. So it's speculated or inferred from the evidence of his skeletal remains that Shanidar 1 had help surviving. Someone helped him get food, someone helped him gain shelter, and again, took care of him. On the bottom left is a photo of his skeleton. A typical Neanderthal with that very heavy skull and heavy brow ridge. But the recreation of his face with the artist's help gives us an idea of how robust this individual appeared relative to what we think of as Homo sapiens today. But we can see that the facsimile of his injured arms, his humerus from his right arm, is definitely much smaller, and of course missing the bottom elbow joint compared to his left. So he definitely had a serious disability. Only had one hand to do things, which in ancient times certainly couldn't have been easy to get around and take care of yourself. Some other evidence that we have that human beings performed some kind of surgical skill or tried to care for one another is in the form of trepanation. The trepanned skulls that we see in these photographs, some of which date back to 40,000 BCE in Mesopotamia, often have evidence of not only holes that were drilled in the skull, but healing. Scientists can evaluate, or pathologists, those are folks that study abnormalities in the human condition, can study the margin or the edges of these holes and can determine whether or not the injury was at the time of death because there was no healing that occurred, or if it was some kind of surgery that was performed and the patient survived because the margin of that opening would show, again, some signs of healing of the bone. Now, why our ancestors performed trepanation, we really don't know. But we speculate that possibly if someone had some kind of constant sources of headache, or if they had some injury, there's even, of course, speculation these were done for spiritual reasons. But trepanation was one of those surgical skills or activities that our ancestors did perform that we suspect is related to, again, first aid, medical intervention, and then post-care, aftercare, once the patient had gone through this procedure.